Clara Thorne, 42 years old, had lived in that seaside mansion for 12 years. But that afternoon, her husband looked her straight in the eyes and declared that before sunset, she had to leave the very home she had created. Julian Vance set his wineglass on the table, pulled Chloe Bennet closer to his side, and pushed the divorce papers toward Clara. There was not a trace of remorse on his face, only the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already calculated everything. Clara did not touch the papers. 12 years earlier, Julian had been nothing more than a mid-level manager at a small resort company. He had ambition and a polished appearance, but he had no money, no connections, and no access to the boardrooms where major projects were decided. Clara had opened that door for him. She was born into the Thorne family, a dynasty that owned several hotels along the West Coast, but Clara had never enjoyed appearing in the press. She chose to become a landscape architect. Where others saw an empty stretch of land, she saw a garden that could make guests want to stay. It was Clara who designed the infinity pool that drew investors' attention to the corporation. She persuaded her father to give Julian the opportunity to manage his first project, then stepped out of the spotlight so her husband could stand in front of the cameras and accept all the praise. At first, Julian was grateful. Later, he began to treat everything as if it were his by right. Over the past 2 years, Clara had noticed a series of small but constant changes. Julian left the house before dawn and returned after the hallway lights had already been turned off. His phone was always placed face down on the table. Whenever a message arrived, he immediately left the room. The scent of lilies began clinging to Julian's suits, so strong that it was almost unpleasant. Clara had never worn that perfume. She asked him about it once. Julian said the scent came from the hotel lobby. She asked a second time. He became furious, accusing her of being controlling and distrustful. From that day on, Clara stopped asking. She observed. She memorized the business trips with no airline tickets, the restaurant bills for two, and the nights Julian claimed to be in meetings while his car was spotted near Chloe's apartment. Chloe was the new head of communications, hired less than a year earlier. Clara did not cry. She did not confront him either. She called Arthur Pendleton, the attorney who had served the Thorne family for 3 decades. Arthur reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the trust documents, and Julian's rights to manage the shares. After several hours, he said only one thing. "Do not do anything yet. Let him believe he has won." 3 days later, Clara returned to the mansion earlier than expected. She walked toward the private garden she had designed with her own hands. Between the white rose bushes and the pond reflecting the afternoon light, Julian was holding Chloe in his arms. They did not have time to pull apart. Chloe turned pale. Julian did not. He straightened his collar, walked toward Clara, and coldly announced that their marriage was over. The mansion, control of the corporation, and the shares bearing Clara's name would soon belong to him. Clara looked at him for a long time. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She simply asked, "Are you certain that everything you are standing on truly belongs to you?" Julian laughed. He had no idea that at that exact moment, Arthur Pendleton was driving through the iron gates with documents capable of erasing every ounce of power Julian believed he had stolen. Arthur Pendleton's black car stopped in front of the steps, just as Julian raised his glass and announced to more than 30 guests that a new chapter of his life had begun. Inside the mansion, music echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Expensive bottles of wine were opened one after another. Hotel executives, investment partners, and several of Julian's longtime friends moved from room to room as though they were attending a coronation. Chloe was wearing Clara's silver silk dress, which had been left in the dressing room. She descended the staircase with one hand resting on the wooden banister, her face glowing like that of a woman who had already become the mistress of the mansion. She even told the interior architect that the eastern garden would be destroyed. "We are going to build a pickleball court there. Julian does not need those old rose bushes anymore." Several guests laughed. No one noticed Clara standing silently at the end of the hallway, listening to every word they said about the garden she had spent nearly 3 years completing. Julian saw her, but he did not appear uncomfortable. He wanted Clara to witness everything. He wanted her to understand that there was no longer a place for her there. Just as Julian was about to introduce Chloe to the board of directors, the front door opened. Arthur entered carrying an old brown leather briefcase. He was not dressed for the party, had no assistant with him, and paid no attention to the wine glasses that had frozen halfway to people's lips. Julian frowned. "This is a private party." Arthur placed the briefcase on the table in the center of the living room. "I know. I am here to correct a few misunderstandings before you continue celebrating." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Chloe moved closer to Julian. She was still smiling, but her hand had tightened around his arm. Arthur removed a thick file. He began with the mansion. The seaside property was not registered in Clara's name. It had never been registered in Julian's name either. The entire estate belonged to the Thorne Family Trust, established 50 years earlier by Clara's grandfather. The smile vanished from Julian's face. He argued that he had lived there for more than a decade, paid maintenance costs, and signed numerous renovation contracts. Arthur calmly explained that the right to reside in a property was not the same as ownership. Julian had only been permitted to use the mansion as the spouse of the trust's primary beneficiary, and that right had ended the moment his infidelity was confirmed. Arthur placed photographs of Julian and Chloe at a hotel on the table, along with records of fabricated business trips and receipts paid with the company credit card. The entire room fell silent. Julian turned toward Clara. For the first time that night, he looked at her not with contempt, but with fear. Arthur continued by opening the prenuptial agreement. Under the clause protecting the family's assets, every right to manage shares granted to Julian during the marriage would be revoked without condition if he committed adultery or used marital assets to support an extramarital relationship. The 35% stake Julian had boasted about had never truly belonged to him. It was merely conditional voting authority delegated by the trust. As of that night, the authority returned to Clara. Several members of the board quietly set down their glasses. But Arthur was not finished. He took out a set of bank statements and pushed them toward Julian. Over the course of 8 months, Julian had transferred 15% of the corporation's communications budget to a newly established consulting company. The owner of that company was Chloe Bennett. Chloe stepped backward. She looked at Julian, then at the numbers on the paper. Julian had told her that the money was his personal profit. He had never told her it belonged to the corporation. Arthur explained that the records had already been forwarded to the auditing department and legal counsel. The transfers could constitute abuse of authority, falsification of financial records, and misappropriation of corporate assets. Whispers spread throughout the room. The people who had raised their glasses to Julian moments earlier began searching for excuses to leave. One partner walked straight out the door without saying goodbye. 2 board members moved to Arthur's side, as though a distance of only a few steps could protect them from the scandal erupting around them. Chloe looked around the mansion. The paintings, the cars, the vacations, and even the dress she was wearing had suddenly become evidence of a life that had never belonged to Julian. She turned toward him, her voice trembling. "You said all of this was yours." Julian could not answer. Clara stepped forward, removed the mansion key from its hook, and placed it in front of him. "The party is over." This time, no one laughed. The next morning, Julian Vance woke on the sofa in his study, surrounded by uncollected wine glasses and a mansion so quiet that he could clearly hear the clock ticking on the wall. In a single night, everyone who had once called him the most powerful man in the resort industry had disappeared. Julian's phone vibrated constantly. The first call came from the bank. 2 personal loans secured by his executive income had been placed under urgent review. The second call came from the chairman of the board. A special meeting would take place at 9 that morning. The third call came from the legal department. Julian did not answer. He called Chloe. There was no response. He called a second time, then a third. By the 4th attempt, his number had been blocked. While Julian paced the room in panic, Chloe was sitting in a rental car in the airport parking lot. Beside her were 2 large suitcases and a handbag containing the money that remained from the consulting company. She had no intention of staying to face the investigation with Julian. Chloe had loved the image Julian created. She had never loved the man he truly was. The board meeting lasted less than an hour. Julian entered wearing a wrinkled suit, trying to maintain his composure. He said the money transfers were merely consulting expenses. He called the affair a private matter and insisted that no one had the right to use his marriage to judge his ability to run the corporation. But this time, no one was afraid of him. The documents Arthur provided showed that Julian had approved contracts without competitive bidding, concealed his personal relationship with Chloe, and transferred millions of dollars from the corporation's budget to a business that conducted almost no real operations. The chairman of the board read the decision to remove him from office. It took effect immediately. Julian's access card, executive accounts, and all signing authority were revoked before he left the room. He stood there in stunned silence. 12 years of climbing to the top ended in less than 60 minutes. When Julian returned to the mansion, 2 security officers were waiting at the gate. Arthur had issued formal notice. Julian had 72 hours to collect his personal belongings. The next 3 days were the most humiliating of his life. The man who once needed only to raise a hand for an assistant to bring him coffee now had to pack every cardboard box himself. He dragged his suitcases through the hallway under the guards' cold stares. Neighbors stood behind their windows and watched the moving truck leave one load at a time. No one came outside to greet him. No one offered to help. Julian moved into a small hotel near the city center. The room was narrow, and the window looked directly onto the parking lot. Every night, he sat on the edge of the bed and called the people who had once shared dinner with him. Most of them did not answer. The rest simply said they were busy. By the 5th day, Julian learned that Clara was temporarily staying at a hotel owned by the corporation. He went there in desperation. Clara had just entered the lobby when Julian rushed toward her. In front of dozens of guests and employees, he dropped to his knees. He cried, apologized, and said that Chloe had taken advantage of him. He promised to sign every document, surrender every claim, and spend the rest of his life correcting his mistakes. Julian was no longer begging because of love. He was begging because, for the first time, he understood that without Clara, he no longer knew who he was. Clara looked at the man before her. She remembered the years when she had believed in him. She remembered the nights she stayed awake revising designs, the calls she made to connect him with the right investors, and every time she stood behind the stage while he stepped forward to receive the applause. There was no anger left inside her, only a very quiet emptiness. Clara said she forgave the betrayal, not because Julian deserved forgiveness, but because she did not want to carry it with her for the rest of her life. Julian looked up, his eyes suddenly filled with hope. But Clara had not finished. Forgiveness does not mean giving trust back to a man who spent 12 years proving that he was unworthy of it. She walked past him. Julian remained on his knees in the middle of the hotel lobby as the elevator doors slowly closed in front of him. For the first time, he understood that some things could be lost in a single moment but could never be recovered, no matter how desperately a person begged. 1 year after Julian knelt in the hotel lobby, Clara Thorne stood on the balcony of the seaside mansion and watched the sun slowly rise above the horizon. The place that had once witnessed her betrayal no longer carried any trace of that painful afternoon. The eastern garden had been completely redesigned. The old white rose bushes had not been destroyed as Chloe had once declared. Clara preserved every plant, arranging them in a sweeping curve around the central pond. Natural stone paths wound between layers of greenery, leading to an open terrace overlooking the sea. There was no pickleball court. There were no extravagant statues. There was only light, wind, and the peace Clara had spent years trying to recover. Architectural circles called the project the Garden of Rebirth. It won an international award for sustainable landscape design and appeared in several major magazines. But to Clara, the garden's true value did not lie in certificates or praise. It was proof that a place that had once caused her pain could still become the foundation of a new life. After the divorce, Clara did not return to being the woman who stood behind another person's success. She founded a design firm under her own name, hired young architects who had been overlooked by large corporations, and gave them the opportunity to stand in front of the projects they had created themselves. Within a year, Clara's company secured contracts to renovate 3 seaside resorts and a large urban park. This time, her name appeared on every design. This time, she stepped onto the stage to receive her own awards. Arthur Pendleton visited the mansion one afternoon in late autumn. He still carried the same old leather briefcase, but this time it contained no legal notices or records of betrayal. There was only a bottle of wine and a copy of the article about the Garden of Rebirth. Arthur stood beside the pond, watching the treetops sway in the wind. "Your grandfather would be very proud." Clara smiled. As a child, she had thought the trust was nothing more than a dry system of legal documents. It was only after her marriage to Julian that she understood her grandfather had not created it to control his descendants. He had created it to protect them from people who loved only the wealth attached to their family name. Arthur said that preparation was not a sign of suspicion. Sometimes, it was how love survived long after the person who created it was gone. Clara looked at the garden before her. She had not defeated Julian through a loud act of revenge. She had not destroyed him, exposed every secret to the media, or used her family's power to crush the life he had left. Julian had done that himself through his own greed. After losing his position, he moved into a cramped rental apartment in the suburbs. Major companies refused to hire him because the financial investigation remained on his record. Eventually, Julian accepted a low-level real estate consulting job, calling customers one by one and trying to sell apartments he once would not have bothered to enter. Each month, most of his income went toward paying his debts and returning the money that had been improperly transferred. Chloe never came back. Her company was shut down. The money she took quickly ran out, and the people who had once called her a communications star disappeared when the scandal no longer benefited them. Someone once asked Clara whether she felt satisfied when she heard that Julian was living in hardship. She thought for a long time before answering, "No." Julian's downfall could not bring back the years she had lost. It could not heal the nights when she had lain silently beside a husband who was no longer honest. What healed Clara was the moment she stopped measuring her worth by the way other people treated her. That afternoon, Clara walked down into the garden, placed her hand against the trunk of an old rose bush, and watched the new petals beginning to open. Arthur asked whether she ever regretted the marriage. Clara gently shook her head. "I regret the woman who once believed she had to make herself smaller to keep a man from leaving." The sea breeze moved through the trees. Clara lifted her head, her face calm beneath the final sunlight of the day. She was no longer the wife who had been driven from the home she had built. She was the woman who had reclaimed her name, her power, and her future. And for the first time in many years, the life before her was no longer a garden designed to please someone else. Sometimes, the strongest revenge is not destroying the person who betrayed you. It is rebuilding your life so completely that they no longer have the power to hurt you. Do you think Clara was right to forgive Julian but refuse to take him back? Or should she have given him one final chance after 12 years of marriage? Share your opinion in the comments below. If this story kept you watching until the end, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story of betrayal, justice, and unexpected karma.